Joining me now is the journalist Adam Boulton and author Ella Wheeler. Well, welcome to both of you. Great to see you.
I believe that photograph.
One day I'll tell the real story, but it was a proud moment. Adam, great to have you. One of the great doyens of the television journalism industry. You, better than most people in this country, can put into proper perspective where we are with Partygate, because every time I hear somebody going, it doesn't matter, we should move on, I feel the shackles rising inside me, because I think it does matter and we shouldn't move on. Am I wrong? Am I exaggerating the scale of this?
Yeah, I think it does matter for two reasons. First of all, because we all went through the pandemic. All of us had to change our lives. You had long COVID and all the rest of it, and we all changed our behaviour. People who were telling us to do that and punish us if we didn't were the government. And they were going on television saying that. Now, if they weren't obeying their own rules, I think that's very serious. And it's an example of a serious matter, which now looks a bit trivial because we feel we're past the pandemic. And, you know, what about parties? So I think that's the first reason why it matters. The second reason why it matters is because it matters to have a government we can trust. And if you have a government there that has consistently had to change its story, been proven to say things which aren't true. I mean, just look at this latest stuff about Boris Johnson leaning on Sue Gray not to publish her report.
I mean, really shocking.
Yeah, and initially they said, oh, there wasn't a meeting. Then they said it was a meeting she asked for. Then they had to admit that he asked for it. And now we have this evidence coming in the Times that, you know, they were trying to sit on the whole inquiry, which has dominated politics for the past 6 months. All of that matters.
Yeah, I totally agree. And Ella, I mean, I read that there's a BBC documentary, Panorama, out tonight, which has a litany of detail about what was going on at these parties from people who were there. And when you see the scale of it and the sort of the impunity that these people at the heart of Downing Street were behaving whilst everybody else was obeying the laws they'd laid down, even to the extent that they were saying to some officials at Downing Street, mocking them for expressing even a raised eyebrow about what was going on, actually mocking people for saying, shouldn't you not be doing this? It's quite shocking when you get into the weeds of this, isn't it?
Call me a cynic, but you know, politicians acting with impunity, lying, having one rule for them, one for us.
Yeah, but is that a good thing?
No, it's not a good thing. It's not a good thing.
And we should never tolerate it.
But it was ever thus. And I think I think you're absolutely right that we shouldn't forget this, but not potentially for the reasons that you're saying, because the most frustrating thing for me is that this is this scandal over how a government acted, and indeed how an opposition party acted, how everyone did throughout a pandemic, has boiled down to the question of a PCN and whether or not, holding a drink like that constitutes a party. And that really trivialises, I think, the central point of this, which is, what do we actually care about? Because parties in and of themselves, in the abstract, there's no problem with it. The problem was that that members of government and civil servants and that were having a good time while they were legislating to criminalise people who sat together on a bench.
To me, it's not about parties.
Yeah, but
it's about the brazen hypocrisy and double standard.
But for the future, I think what's important to recognise is that, Boris Johnson and other cabinet ministers are still dangling the prospect of lockdown measures and things like that for the future. And I think what we have to, the real reason...
Why would anyone trust a word they say?
Well, the real reason we have to hold them to account is to say what really was the tragedy and what really was the thing that was wrong was that you criminalised people who sat next to each other on a bench, particularly in the latter stages of the last 2 years, not that you had a party. So I just want people to get their priorities straight.
In a way, that's a secondary issue because they did make those laws. Now, you can argue about whether they should and whether they should again.
I think it's the primary issue because I think...
Well, no, because
I don't think it changes the hypocrisy. If you make laws, you've got to abide by them yourselves, right?
I mean, it would probably be different next time round. People have learnt from it. But at the time, that's what they were telling us to do, and they weren't doing it themselves. And it does come down to trust. And yes, it's trivial parties, but what's becoming clear is Boris Johnson is a very trivial Prime Minister.
And also...
he's not someone who is wading into the big issues, who has a clear view.
Let's also be clear.
And
also be clear, he's a liar. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But he's been fired from several jobs in the past for lying, and he's been lying about these parties. He's stood there in Parliament and said everything was above board, all on the rules. That party, we're told now by people who were there, up to 30 people were on the lash. Apparently, it was every Friday at 4 o'clock. the press team all had their knees up.
But I mean, he's debased everybody. You see, he's reduced us to arguing about when is a party, and does holding a glass minute, which I find humiliating. I mean, we know what a party is.
Yes, exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
But then on top of that, what we're seeing is junior people in Downing Street carrying the can. They're the ones who've been fined. And if your boss says we're having a party, you go. You may not want to go. And we know that 50% of the people invited to the Downing Street party didn't go, but a junior person, an ambitious person, will go if their boss throws a party.
But ultimately, Adam, I mean, the only way Boris Johnson will go is not what you or I think or what even the British public think until an election. The only way is if 56 Tory MPs decide that his behaviour, and the Sue Gray report is due out tomorrow and may be more damning than we're even expecting, but if it's just more of the same in huge detail, could it trigger enough Tory MPs to actually grow a pair, get a conscience, and send in letters to have a leadership election?
Yeah, I do think it could, because I think if it is clear to the Conservatives that he's become a liability, and remember, since this broke, they've been behind in the polls, and Boris Johnson is currently less popular than the Conservative Party. Now, they're not going to put up with that forever, except if you have the argument that the next election's a good one to lose, but that's not how most politicians think.
And Ella, on one other issue today, which I thought was big in the news, Afghanistan. The British role in that absolute debacle of a overnight departure, which betrayed all the Afghan people, looked about as shameful as the Americans when you actually get into the detail of this report that's come out.
Yeah, I mean, if you were waiting for the report to inform your decision about, how we handled this, you obviously weren't watching the footage that we all saw at the time of people standing in sewage, scrambling for planes. These are people that took a risk working with the British government. And I'm really sick of watching and listening to all the crocodile tears from certain Conservative MPs about how difficult this was to handle.
Yes, it's nonsense.
Or indeed from people within the Foreign Office about how hard they worked, because quite simply, this was from the start mishandled. And also, I think it's not just a case of people not catching emails. It fundamentally shows, from both the UK and the US perspective, the disregard with which the West treats people in nations that it meddles in.
And the grotesque betrayal of the Afghan people, where you now have the women in particular, even female TV presenters having to wear masks now on television, not because of COVID, but because the Taliban have ordered them to put veils on it. I think it's completely shameful.